They say when a young American man from coastal Florida drove a truck packed with explosives into a hilltop restaurant in Syria in May 2014, FBI agents scoured his online postings and interviewed his contacts in Florida in a scramble to determine who, if anyone, might try to launch a similar attack inside the United States. And now, one of the people they spoke to was Omar Mateen, a young security guard from a nearby town who had attended the same mosque as a suicide bomber and had been on a terrorism watch list for inflammatory comments he once made to coworkers at a local courthouse. But the FBI soon ended its examination of Mr. Mateen after finding no evidence that he posed a terrorist threat to his community. But obviously, he did pose a terrorist threat. So then, that hopeful conclusion was upended in a bloody spasm of violence when Mr. Mateen fatally shot dozens of people in a nightclub in Orlando, Florida, before being killed by police officers who stormed the club to end the standoff. The horrific events at the Pulse nightclub left 49 dead and have left family members, neighbors, and federal investigators trying to piece together clues about what might have led Mr. Mateen, 29, to carry out such unspeakable violence. The government investigation could take months, but an early examination of Mr. Mateen's life reveals a stew of contradictions. He was a man who could be charming, loved Afghan music, and enjoyed dancing at family ceremonies, but he was also violently abusive. Family members said he was not overly religious, but he was rigid and conservative in his view that his wife should remain mostly at home. The FBI director said that Mr. Mateen had once claimed ties to both Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, two radical groups violently opposed to each other. Investigators now face the question of how much the killings were the act of a deeply disturbed man, as his former wife and others described him, and how much he was driven by religious or political ideology. Whatever drove him to carry out the shootings, his actions highlight the difficulty for the American government in trying to address a new style of terrorism. Random acts of violence that may have been at least partly inspired by the Islamic State, but were not directed by the group's leaders. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which favors highly organized and planned operations, they say that the Islamic State has encouraged anyone to take up arms in its name and uses a sophisticated campaign of social media to inspire future attacks by unstable individuals with little history of embracing radical Islam. President Obama said that there was no evidence that the Islamic State actually directed the attack, which would make Mr. Mateen's case. American officials have said that those under surveillance in the United States for possible ties to the group usually have little terrorism expertise or outside support, which makes thwarting an Islamic State-inspired attack less like stopping a traditional act of terrorism and more like trying to prevent a shooting at a school or movie theater. Federal investigators are now left to sift through disparate clues in search of any clear motive for the mass shooting. ISIS has tried to turn the bloody event into a propaganda coup, and on Monday, the group's daily news bulletin boasted about the great victory carried out by our brother, Omar Mateen. Mr. Mateen's father was unequivocal on Monday that his son had committed an act of terrorism, but the elder Mateen and other family members said they were still puzzled why a young man who had never been particularly religious is now being tied to the Islamic State's murderous ideology. They said that at this point they could find no easy explanations. There is also a spiritual side to all this. May the Lord rest their souls. This too is another sign of the end of times as we know them. Transition days, which is a time of extraordinary happenings, events, and changes, because it's still about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations, and that should be a very important question to ask. Again, Revelation chapter 16, verse 8. And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch humans with fire. 9. And humans were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which has power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. 10. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom or nation was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. 11. And blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. 12. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings and leaders of the east might be prepared. Yes, it's time for the physical and spiritual manifestation of the book of Revelation. And this is what I see, think, feel, and spiritually discern. More guns and more nuclear weapons will make us safer. Right. Just like using more fossil fuels will somehow cool down the earth.